When America Was Great for African Americans, Part 1. From the end of the Civil War until 1900, unemployment among African Americans was extremely high due to systemic racism, discriminatory practices, and limited access to skilled jobs, with the majority forced into low-paying agricultural work like sharecropping, resulting in a de facto state of near-permanent underemployment, even when technically employed. Accurate unemployment statistics were not readily available during this period, but the rate was significantly higher compared to white Americans. Key points about African American unemployment during this era. Sharecropping. The widespread practice of sharecropping kept many Black Americans trapped in a cycle of debt and poverty, where they worked on land they didn't own, often receiving little compensation for their labor. Black Codes. Southern states enacted black codes that restricted the rights and freedoms of formerly enslaved people, limiting their employment options and contributing to high unemployment. Jim Crow laws. Following Reconstruction, the implementation of Jim Crow laws further segregated African Americans from white society, severely limiting their access to better jobs and education. Limited skilled labor. Most African Americans were relegated to unskilled labor jobs like manual labor on farms or domestic service, with little opportunity to gain skills for higher-paying positions. Violence and intimidation. The threat of violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan further discouraged Black Americans from seeking better employment opportunities. Overall, while precise unemployment figures are not available, the period from the end of the Civil War to 1900 saw consistently high unemployment rates for African Americans due to pervasive discrimination and societal barriers that limited their access to quality employment. When America Was Great for African Americans, Part 2. From 1900 to 1945, African American unemployment rates were consistently much higher than the national average, particularly during the Great Depression, where their unemployment often reached double the rate of white Americans, with estimates showing that during the 1930s, up to 50% of African Americans were unemployed compared to around 25% of the general population. Key points about African American unemployment during this period: systemic discrimination, racial segregation, and discriminatory hiring practices significantly limited job opportunities for African Americans, causing high unemployment rates across various industries. Impact of the Great Depression. When the Great Depression hit, African Americans were disproportionately affected due to their concentration in low-skilled, vulnerable jobs, leading to massive job losses. Regional disparities. While unemployment was high across the country, African Americans in the South often faced the most severe joblessness due to the entrenched Jim Crow system. New Deal programs. While some New Deal programs aimed to alleviate unemployment, they were often poorly implemented for African Americans, leading to limited access to relief efforts. When America Was Great for African Americans, Part 3. Throughout the 1950s, unemployment rates for African Americans were consistently significantly higher than those for white Americans, often running at double the rate, with Black people facing systemic discrimination in the job market, leading to limited access to better-paying jobs and higher rates of unemployment, particularly in the South. This trend was especially pronounced during economic downturns. Key points about African American unemployment in the 1950s. Significantly higher than white unemployment. The unemployment rate for African Americans was consistently at least double the rate for white Americans throughout the decade. Impact of segregation. Racial segregation in employment practices meant Black workers were often relegated to low-paying, unskilled jobs, leaving them more vulnerable to layoffs during economic fluctuations. Limited job opportunities in the South. Mechanization of agriculture in the South displaced many Black workers, contributing to high unemployment rates in the region. Last hired, first fired. When economic conditions worsened, Black workers were often the first to be laid off due to discriminatory hiring practices. During the 1960s, unemployment rates for African Americans were significantly higher than for white Americans, often running at roughly twice the rate, meaning that for every unemployed white person, there were approximately 2 unemployed black people. This disparity was a major issue during the civil rights movement due to systemic racial discrimination in the job market. Key points about African American unemployment in the 1960s. High unemployment rate. Black unemployment consistently remained much higher than white unemployment throughout the decade, with the gap sometimes exceeding double the rate. Impact of mechanization. The mechanization of agriculture in the South, where many black people worked, contributed to rising unemployment among African Americans. Limited job opportunities in northern cities. As technology advanced, many unskilled jobs in northern cities, which were historically held by black workers, were eliminated, leading to high unemployment rates in urban areas. Discrimination in hiring, racial discrimination in employment practices significantly limited job opportunities for African Americans, contributing to their high unemployment rates. During the 1970s, unemployment rates for African Americans were significantly higher than for white Americans, consistently remaining at roughly double the rate, with many experiencing unemployment rates consistently above 10%, highlighting a persistent issue of economic disparity in the United States. Even during periods of economic growth, black unemployment remained high compared to white unemployment. Key points about African American unemployment in the 1970s. High relative rates. Black unemployment was typically around twice the rate of white unemployment throughout the decade. Persistent issue. Despite some gains in other areas like education and home ownership, high unemployment for African Americans remained a major concern. Impact of economic fluctuations. While economic downturns affected all workers, black workers were disproportionately impacted due to factors like job discrimination and limited access to higher-paying occupations. When America Was Great for African Americans, Part 4. During the 1980s, unemployment rates for both blacks and whites fluctuated with changing economic conditions, rising as high as 19.5% for blacks in 1983. The data suggests that finding a job is particularly difficult for black teenagers. Among blacks 16 to 19 years old, about 1/3 were unemployed in 1988. In 1980, employment patterns for black and white workers were similar, but black workers were disproportionately affected by the downturn. Employment decline. Both black and white workers experienced employment declines in the first half of 1980. Earlier downturn. The downturn for black workers began earlier than for white workers. Recovery. Both groups saw some recovery in the second half of 1980. Employment levels. At the end of the year, employment levels for both black and white workers were only slightly below their peaks from the previous year. Other unemployment statistics for African Americans in the 1980s include: in 1983, black unemployment reached 19.5%. In 1988, about 1/3 of black teenagers were unemployed. More than 21% of African Americans between the ages of 20 and 24 were unemployed. More workers were employed part-time in 1980, with 22% of all workers working part-time. 31% of workers who worked part-time in 1980 attributed it to unfavorable economic conditions. The unemployment rate for African Americans has been consistently higher than that for white Americans for most of the past 6 decades. During the 1990s, unemployment rates for African Americans remained significantly higher than those for white Americans. Although they did see some improvement throughout the decade, particularly during the economic boom towards the end, with the black unemployment rate consistently hovering around double the white rate, meaning that even during periods of economic growth, African Americans still experienced disproportionately high unemployment compared to white Americans. Key points about African American unemployment in the 1990s: persistently higher than white unemployment. Throughout the decade, the unemployment rate for African Americans was roughly double that of white Americans. Economic recovery brought some improvement. While the gap remained large, the strong economy in the late 1990s saw a decline in African American unemployment, bringing it closer to the white rate than in previous periods. Impact on specific demographics. Black males, particularly those with lower education levels, continued to experience the highest unemployment rates within the African American community. Disproportionate impact of recessions. Studies show that African Americans are more severely affected by economic downturns and take longer to recover from them compared to white Americans. According to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the unemployment rate for African Americans in the 2000s averaged around 8%, with the rate fluctuating between 7.6% in 2000 and reaching a high of 10.8% in 2003. Indeed, in April 2023, the unemployment rate for black workers dropped to 4.8%, the lowest since reports began. The latest data shows that unemployment rate for black workers was 5.6% in April 2024, continuing the trend of low unemployment rate for this African Americans by historical standards,